right here. So it's a pleasure to be back at PEMNA. Like Jim, I was at the inaugural session nearly a decade ago, and it's really quite amazing to see how many colleagues from so many different ministries are there today. And it's I'm going to do a presentation here that's divided in two parts. The first part is around climate expenditure tagging. The second part is very short about public investment in climate change. I think that one of the key things on expenditure tagging is focus on trying to link expenditures and policy, which is something that we're all supposed to do, and our standard budget classifications are supposed to provide the tools for doing that. Trouble is that standard budget classifications aren't particularly good at dealing with cross-cutting issues. And we found that 20 years ago when we started trying to track poverty-related expenditures. More recently, we've come across this issue when we tried to look at gender-related expenditures. And what we find is you actually need to do additional analysis of the budget to identify those kinds of expenditures that are related to the policy objective. So climate budget tagging is about the identification, measurement, and monitoring of climate-relevant activities and expenditure. This is a practice that's been going on now for, well, over a decade. And it started in East Asia. I mean, on the left-hand side of this slide, there's a document that the World Bank prepared working with the colleagues in the Ministry of Finance in the Philippines. More recently, there's a lot of work that's been done in Indonesia on budget tagging. There's been work in Bangladesh, in Nepal, Fiji. Many countries around the world are actually taking on budget tagging as a tool. What I'm going to present here is the results of a research project that we did last year, reviewing, I think it was about 20 different countries' experience of budget tagging, climate budget tagging. Many of those countries were in East Asia. There were emerging countries in Europe, which are taking quite a different tack on this agenda. But it's gradually spreading across the world. I mean, in the last 4 or 5 months, I think I've heard of 5 or 6 countries that have initiated work on doing climate budget tagging. So it's something that's emerging as a very popular practice as a way of trying to think about how ministries of finance can work on climate change issues. EU has given it a really big push. I think you had a presenter at the beginning of this session of PEMNA from the EU delegation who was talking about their focus on climate change issues. What they've done is to try and track expenditures from the Commission, which are grants paid to EU member states, and make sure that those are a large proportion. I think it's about 30% is supposed to be assigned to climate-related expenditures, and they're using a tagging methodology to achieve that tracking process. And many countries in Europe are actually following up on this. France took a big step forward in trying to put in a tagging methodology for its budget in 2020. Finland is doing so. Italy is doing so. I think it's something that's expanding rapidly across the European Union, mainly in terms of trying to show the fiscal effort in support of climate change objectives. One of the things that's unusual in the EU is that they've also tried to identify both expenditures that are supportive of climate change and expenditures which are brown or have a detrimental impact on climate change policy. And there is a substantial share of those expenditures in most countries' budgets. So why do countries do climate budget tagging? Well, based on the documentation that we found, the most common objectives are related to awareness raising, trying to get align ministries to focus on climate change issues, align their resources with climate change policy, improve transparency around the climate change agenda, particularly in terms of making people aware of what climate change programs and activities are underway in the budget, mobilizing finance, particularly amongst developing countries. There's a lot of focus on tagging as a tool for identifying potential areas of financing from external partners. And there's an issue around reporting on policy commitments. So I should stress that international treaties through the UNFCCC do not require any reporting by developing countries on their, or actually Part 1 countries either, on their domestic climate change expenditures. So this is not a treaty obligation. This is something that countries do because they think it is useful for them in support of their climate policy objectives. So I'll go over quickly the different elements of climate budget tagging that we looked at through the research project. There's a set of technical aspects of climate budget tagging related to the definition of what is climate relevant, coverage of the tagging methodology, the measurement of those expenditures and how you use the budget structure to reflect those tagged expenditures. And then there's a whole set of institutional issues about how you manage the process of doing climate budget tagging. Who are the stakeholders involved? Who does it? Who validates? How you integrate it in the budget process, and how you do your tracking, reporting, and auditing. So first of all, on the definitions, there are broadly two sets of definitions. The first one is a standardized definition that would be basically the same definition used in multiple countries. The standard definition, that set of definitions that countries use, are related to the Rio markers. Now, those are a set of programs that were identified as being related to climate change for the purposes of measuring, financing, or development assistance in support of the Rio Conventions, which are the conventions related to climate change, desertification, and biodiversity. The one that's really picked up is the Rio markers for climate change. All development organizations apply this. This is the basis of the methodology that the EU is rolling out for its own internal financing of funding for member states. The second type of definition is one that is policy-based, where you're not trying to standardize your definition by following a set of rules that were set by an international organizations and will be comparable, roughly comparable across countries. You define what your climate policy objectives are for your country, and you base your definition of expenditures on those policy objectives. In some countries, they mix them. They have a mixture of both a standardized approach and some elements of a policy-based approach. So an example here comes from Pakistan, where they've used a mix of the Rio markers plus some element of a filter that's based on their policy objectives. So they only cover those elements of the strategy of the Rio markers that are consistent with their their climate change policies. What the coverage of those is related really to what range of expenditures are covered. Many countries actually start piloting tagging with a few sectors, and then roll out. There are quite a few countries now that are covering all sectors. Some countries only tag their investment budgets. That's because it's relatively easy to tag investment budgets. Projects have objectives. You can identify by looking at the objectives and the outputs of the project, whether or not it is related to climate policy objectives. Much more difficult when it comes to recurrent expenditures. One thing that very few countries are doing, in fact only one country has done systematically so far, is to look at tax expenditures. That was France. And what they found was that a large part of their climate-related expenditures were actually tax expenditures. Those are subsidies that are affected through the tax regime. So discounted tax rates for activities such as use of renewable energies. But what they also found was that a large part of the tax expenditures were actually environmentally harmful and contrary to their climate policy objectives, particularly fossil fuel subsidies and a large part of the subsidies for agriculture. Many of the countries now expanding their climate change tagging to cover subnationals. A handful are looking at SOEs. SOEs are particularly important because they really are, they are often the major actors in key sectors for decarbonization. So around energy, transport, water. Most of the countries that do tagging have to attempt to identify some share of their expenditures that are climate relevant, rather than taking all the expenditures in a particular program or activity or project as being climate related. Some of those use a basis, they try and break down the cost structure of those programs. Others use a relevance weight. So they'll just make an assumption based on the objective of the program or a project. Others use no weighting whatsoever. They just take the whole value of the project, assuming that if it mentions climate change, it must be relevant. Many countries try and integrate it into the budget. The obvious way to do that process, the obvious way to do that is by using your budget codes and tagging your coding structure. That helps you integrate it both for budget preparation and budget monitoring and financial reporting. We've got an example here from Uganda where they've used various elements of the string for identifying expenditures, to identify both the objectives, the policy area, the sector, and a specific strategy which this particular project relates to. Stakeholders are probably one of the most challenging elements of the budget tagging is how to engage with all of the sectors that are involved. You've really got to to have an effective set of information about what the budget is doing, you've got to really involve all of your line ministries. And ideally, if you can, subnational governments and your SOEs. Now, the challenge is whether you do the tagging centrally through the Ministry of Finance, or you do that, you allow the line agencies, the spending agencies, to tag the expenditures based on information that they have on programming objectives and using the guidance provided by the Ministry of Finance. There's advantages and disadvantages to both ways. One of the big advantages of doing it centrally is that you have a very rigorous approach to applying the methodology. You are sure that the methodology is being applied correctly. But then again, there's problems of ownership. You really want to get the line agencies thinking about what their expenditures are and using the tagging as a way of really interrogating their policies and their expenditures to think about whether they're aligned with climate objectives. So ideally, the ideal would be to do it with through the line ministries, and I think that's the growing trend at the moment. Most countries may start by doing it with central agency and then shift over to decentralizing to the line agencies doing the tagging. And then what becomes very important then is that there's a validation process. If the line agencies may have a strong incentive to exaggerate or what we call greenwash their expenditures to show that a large part of their expenditures are aligned with their climate policy, maybe in an attempt to mobilize additional resources. So you really do need to have some entity that's having a look at what the line agencies are doing and interrogating validating whether the classification has been done properly. Most countries are focusing on the budget itself. So the tagging exercise looks at what's the composition of the budget. There may be a report that's generated, published, which identifies climate-related expenditures. It's often done as an annex to the budget. Very few countries are actually tracking those expenditures through the budget process, through to financial reports, budget execution reports, financial reports, and even fewer are actually looking at audits of to determine whether the expenditures have been applied as was originally intended. So this is an area where there's probably a need for further development if we're going to ensure that the quality of the information in the budget tagging, and to make sure that there is a link between the plans and what's actually done. You really need to have some sort of validation exercise at the end of the budget process to check back in terms of the application of funds. So what are the challenges? Well, the big challenge is really using the information. I mean, it is ironic, that in the end, you're doing a tagging exercise to generate information so that you can use it to inform decisions. If you're not using the information, I would question why on earth do you want to gather it? So if you are gathering information, if you are going to get into a budget tagging exercise, it's important to think about how you're going to use the information. Firstly, in terms of resource allocation, what point in the budget process is this information going to be used? Right at the beginning? How is it integrated into the decisions, the negotiations between the Ministry of Finance and the line agency? What kind of information is shared with the legislature, and how will that be impact on resource allocations? So there needs to be a process of thinking about how you're going to impact on budget allocation at the time when you're putting in place any kind of tagging process. How does it impact on resource mobilization? Actually, a lot of countries have expected the budget tagging to facilitate resource mobilization. We tried to check this, and there's very little evidence that it actually does help you mobilize additional resources. Some countries have used budget tagging to support the issuing of green bonds. It can be helpful in that way, but many countries have issued green bonds without any budget tagging, so it is not essential. One issue that I do think is very important is that if you are trying to get a picture of what the impact of your fiscal policy is on your climate change policies, then you do need to think both about those expenditures which are having a positive impact or are aligned with your climate change policies, and those which are contradictory. And the obvious target here is the fossil fuel subsidies. From my perspective, it makes very little sense to publish information in the budget which identifies climate-related expenditures if you're not highlighting also the amount of resources that are being spent on activities such as fossil fuels or agricultural subsidies that are having a detrimental impact on climate change policy. So the climate change tagging does represent a significant administrative burden. I don't think you should enter it into it lightly. It does require additional data collection and data entry, a lot more analysis if it's to be used properly throughout the budget process. I do think it's important to think in terms of using both planned and actual expenditures. Just publishing information on what was planned is only half of the picture. You really do need to have an idea about how resources have been applied. It's also important to consider about what the other drivers of public finance, sector finance are. Climate change is one policy objective, but it's not the only one. You've all been talking about the recovery during the early parts of this session, the need for jobs, the need to address poverty reduction. Climate change is one of many policy objectives that ministries of finance have to address. So when you're doing a budget tagging exercise, it's important to think, well, how does this fit into the broader policy objectives that the Ministry of Finance is trying to achieve? Lastly, there's an ongoing debate about whether we need to have international comparability. Personally, I don't think it's relevant. I think that it's much more important that countries have a climate budget tagging process and structure that meets their needs. So it generates the information that they need to support a policy process and integrate climate change into their policies and into the budget preparation process. So on PIM, I think I'm not going to go into details about how you design your public investment management system and how you to address climate change. I'm going to go over sort of the broad issues the ministries of finance need to be thinking about. And the first of that is to think about what risks we need to address. What are the big climate change challenges the ministries of finance need to be thinking about when they're thinking about they're planning investments that are going to last a long time. Jim Bumby in his presentation referred to the fact that investments last 40, 50, 60, 100 years, some of them. These are the investment decisions we take today, particularly around energy, transport, water, urban design, irrigation, management of coastal areas. These decisions are going to have impacts 50, 100 years from now. So we really need to be taking decisions carefully. There's two sets of things that we need to be thinking about. The first of all is the physical impacts of climate change. So one element of that is extreme events. Now, all of us focus on the extreme events, the droughts, the floods, the cyclones, the typhoons, the extreme cold events, the extreme rainfall events, all of these extremes that, you know, the last IPCC report has finally come out and said that categorically there is evidence that extreme events, not just long-term climate change, is related to climate change, is caused by human-induced climate change. And there's plenty of evidence that extreme events are accelerating. The number and intensity of extreme events is increasing. We should remember that the vulnerability that we face when we're thinking about our society and our economies is not just related to those extreme events, the weather and the climate, but it's also related to human decisions about where we decide to locate in our cities, where we decide to, what lands we decide to use for agriculture, and the types of agriculture and land use that we choose in areas that could be at risk by future events. So one element is the physical risks and the extreme events, which we all focus on, and I'm sure all of you are beginning to consider. The second part is the long-term environmental change. And that's the kind of change that's going to happen because of global warming and the shift in agroecological zones. I use here on the right-hand side a picture for a map of Africa because it's pretty stark there. You can actually see clear border areas where extended areas are going to be at risk of desertification. If you look at a map of East Asia, it's a lot messier. The impacts are very different. It's mainly going to be driven by the monsoon and any changes in the district timing, intensity, duration of the monsoon. It's also going to be driven by sea level rise. Many of the cities in East Asia and largest cities in East Asia are at sea level or are already below sea level and will be severely impacted over the next 10 to 50 to 100 years. So one side of the agenda that we need to think about when we're thinking about public investment is physical impacts, extreme events, long-term change in our environment. The second one is about decarbonization. You know, everybody focuses on the international commitments, and there is an element of a collective, a global public good, and a responsibility of our country, all countries, to contribute to decarbonization. That's the reduction, shifting away from the use of fossil fuels by electrification of processes, use of renewable energies. So that's part of the agenda, but there is also a very important element of self-interest. The world economy is going to change. Technologies will change. Markets will change because of decarbonization. Trade patterns will change. The EU is already talking about a border tax, a carbon adjustment border tax. So no country in the world can afford to ignore the fact that decarbonization is happening and that they need to be part of that process. Failure to anticipate that is going to cause significant harm. Firstly, particularly in terms of public investment. First of all, there's a risk of a disorderly transition. You know, the private sector, citizens, households, they need to know what kind of decisions they're going to take. So they need to get a signal from the public sector about what kind of energy future they should be investing in. Should they be investing in fossil fuels, or should they be investing in renewables? Should they be investing in electrification of transport, of heating, of refrigeration, and all? So there's an important element of signaling that the public sector, and through its investments, does. The public investment will signal what kind of energy future your countries will go through. There's also a risk of stranded assets. If you invest in the wrong kinds of technology, your technology will not be useful 5, 10, 15 years from now, either because of changes in policy, changes in regulations, changes in technology, in the networks that they're operating in, changes in consumer preferences. So you really need to think, well, is this any kind of investment that we're going to do now, is it still going to fit in the networks and the systems that we're going to have 15, 20 years from now? The other risk is around path dependencies. The signals that we use, the kinds of investments we make now, for instance, if we're building cities at low density and using cars for transport, we're going to be stuck with that structure of energy consumption and transport for the next 100 years. So it's cheaper, it's better to think about what you're going to need in the future, and think how to avoid setting yourselves in a path that we will not be able to get out of at a later date. So transition, decarbonization is as important for all countries as adaptation and dealing with the physical risks of climate change. So another element I think it's very important for us to think about is that, we need to think about the networks as a whole. All of our investments in infrastructure are parts of networks. Now, 5, 10 years ago, I think we were all looking at, the massive infrastructure gap that countries had in terms of meeting the needs for basic infrastructures. And this graph comes from, I think it's about 2015, from a World Bank publication, where they identify what the huge gaps in infrastructure needs were around the world. Part of the problem of climate change is that we don't just have to think about the infrastructure gap and what we need to do to meet that in terms of additional infrastructure. We also need to think about the stock of assets that we have, and whether those stock of assets are going to be viable in the future, those stranded assets that I was referring to, and whether we need to be thinking about how we adjust that stock of assets, and how the systems we're going to put in place, and how an individual project that we're working on, how it's going to fit in. If it's a power project, how it's going to fit into a new network that's going to be based on renewable energy. How is a transport system going to be shifting from using cars and road transport to using rail transport and other forms of mass transport? How are we going to use water in the future more efficiently? So we need to think about not just the new projects, but we also need to think about the stock. And that's a big change for us in terms of public investment management, because we're not thinking in those terms. We're listening to the presentations so far, the focus has been very much on the project cycle. Yet the project cycle is very much at the end of the process. We need to be thinking about the system as a whole and how that will change. So I think some of the elements of what we need to think about in terms of what climate change means for the public investment management practices is thinking about, well, what elements of the systems need to change? Well, first of all, I think we need to have clear long-term strategies. Thinking about how we're going to adapt systems over the next 30, 40 years. Transitions like this don't happen overnight. It's very important that we take action now, but that action is going to take place over an extended period. And there needs to be long-term strategies, and those strategies need to be aligned with long-term climate goals. So you can't just think in terms of one project on its own. You need to have a strategy for how you're going to deal with each of the sectors which are going to be impacted by climate change. You need to think about systems, how the systems are working, not just the projects. How does my project fit into the system, the transport system, the water management system, the power grid? You need to think about, when you're looking at individual projects, how is that project going to deal with physical and transition risks? Is it consistent with my policies and my long-term strategy? You need to think about land use. Land use is everything in climate change. It is absolutely a critical element of how you plan, how you think about what kind of assets, where to place them, what kind of land, how is that land going to be used viably economically in the future. And I can promise you one thing, the land use in the future is not going to be the same as the land use today. The environment is changing, and it's changing fast in many countries. Sea level rise, changing water allocation patterns, changing rainfall mean that land use will have to change, and that will have an impact on the kinds of investments that we can take, where we can place investments, and the kinds of investments that are going to be suitable in different locations. And then finally, I mean, once you've got all of that ready, once you've done all those key foundations, then the project cycle is fairly simple. You know, we know how to appraise projects. The key issue is really not so much, I don't think, in terms of appraisal. We have the tools through cost-benefit analysis to think about how we manage these things, climate change, how to incorporate, address different technologies. I think the key thing is it's screening up front to make sure that we're focusing all of the key issues around land use, technology, how projects fit in the system are reviewed at an early stage in the design of projects, so that we don't waste time on projects that aren't suitable. I think one other element that I think is very important is that we need to think about uncertainty. Honestly, we don't know what the future is going to be like. There are huge uncertainties in terms of what the impacts of climate change are going to be on future climate patterns at the local and at the country level. The quality of the information that we're getting now through modeling is improving every year, but there's still a lot of uncertainty about what the impacts are going to be. There's a lot of uncertainty about what technologies are going to be. The fact is that, you know, we know the technologies we have today, and those technologies will probably dominate investment decisions for the next decade. But new technologies will need to be invented, and those technologies will need to be applied in power, in transport, in water management, in domestic heating and cooling, all the areas, critical areas of public investment. There will be new technologies coming on board. We don't know exactly what those are going to be, and we don't know when they're coming on board, but we need to think a little bit about how we're going to manage that as we're planning of the climate future and what that means for investment. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, there are techniques for dealing with uncertainty. You can real options, probabilistic modeling, all of these different techniques can be applied. And if you're designing a really big project like a dam or a Thames barrier system, like in the picture on the left, that's fine. That's very good. You can use those kinds of techniques. But there's a basic principle that I think is very helpful to follow in in the face of uncertainty, and that's just about flexibility. Build some flexibility into the design of projects. In the case of the example here, which is the Thames barrier, yes, they invested a fortune, billions, in a huge dam across the front barrier across the river to protect the City of London. But they also purchased huge areas of land that could absorb a higher level of sea level rise to reduce pressure on the city if the sea level rise was higher than anticipated on the left-hand side. And that land has been set aside. So you can use non-engineering solutions. You don't just need to buy your way out of climate change risks. You can think a little bit about how to incorporate flexibility and how to ensure that you can adapt to different technologies and different climate situations in the future. I think what the UK has invested an awful lot in this agenda over the last 20 years, and they've thought it through quite systematically, and they have a fairly robust set of tools. They have a long-term strategy for clean growth and about how to deal with the climate future that looks at both the role of the public sector and the role of the private sector, and that's absolutely critical because let's face it, most investment in infrastructure is going to be by the private sector. The public sector is going to be a minor player in most countries. So they have a long-term strategy which communicates what the policy is going to be for all government, all levels of government, and for the public sector, for the private sector, and for households. Communicates what the plan is to deal with climate change. They've adapted that to an infrastructure strategy which incorporates all the climate change policies, and that infrastructure strategy identifies how they're going to incorporate climate change into both in terms of physical risks and decarbonization, transition risks and decarbonization into all the major infrastructure sectors: transport, air transport, sea transport, road transport, rail transport, water, energy, tow. They have a broad strategy, and that strategy informs the kinds of projects that they're going to be selecting. And lastly, they have a green book which sets out a set of rules and procedures for doing project screening and project appraisal. And one of the nice things about the green book, I mean, it's proportionate in the demands on the appraisal process. So if you're doing a small project, you can use fairly simplistic tools, simple tools. I think Delphine presented something quite nice at the beginning, a presentation where she was mapping out what was good, simple techniques, medium techniques, and more advanced techniques. And I think that's embodied in the Green Book. And I think that's a good practice for all of us to follow, where if you're going to be integrating climate change into your investment appraisal system, you need to have a different range of tools for different kinds of projects, so that you're not spending a fortune on doing complex analysis for very small projects or projects where you know what the impacts are going to be. So I think I'll leave it there.